Hi there, Michael here. In today's video we will check out the new Dolby Atmos mastering capabilities of Steinberg's Wavelab 13, and we're going to try to answer the question if this is a software solution you should invest in, or if it might be better to go for one of the competitor products such as the Fiedler Audio Mastering Console or the Immersive Master Pro. Before we get started, a quick disclaimer. Wavelab is an incredibly feature-rich application, so this video is not going to be a full tutorial. Rather, think of it as a first look into Atmos mastering with Wavelab. My goal today is to get you started and to compare the software with other Atmos mastering solutions. If there are any particular features you want me to talk about in a future video, leave a comment below. And with that being said, let's open up Wavelab 13. So I've opened up Wavelab, and the first thing that it greets me with is a selection screen where I can select what exactly I want to do with Wavelab. Now in my particular case for this video, what I'm going to look at is the Dolby Atmos section. Obviously there are a couple of other things you can do, but that's not really interesting for this particular video. We're just going to look at Dolby Atmos. And in the Dolby Atmos section, obviously we have recent projects. We can create a new project or open a project. I'm going to create a new one. And there are two different ways in how I can create a project. One is I can create a Dolby Atmos master montage, and the master montage would be exactly what it says. So essentially you take a Dolby Atmos master file and you open that up for mastering. And then you also have the option to create a Dolby Atmos album montage, and that would be equivalent what you would do with the Dolby Atmos album assembler. So you can take in multiple ADMs, multiple Dolby Atmos master files and create an album that way. Now the features are, or what you can do with it, are slightly different between the master montage and the album montage, and I'm not going to talk about the album montage in this particular video. I might actually do a separate video because it's actually quite interesting how that differs to the master montage, and most importantly how this differs to some of the other mastering solutions that are out there, for example the Fiedler Audio Mastering Console, but I'm not going to talk about it in this particular video. I'm actually going to create a Dolby Atmos master montage. Now before I do that, there's one additional thing I need to point out, and that is we need to set up the audio device. Obviously, now in my case I've set that to the Rodecaster so that you guys can actually hear what I'm doing here. And the one thing that you need to make sure is if you go into the settings, you need to make sure that the buffer size is set to 512 because it requires that the buffer is set to that. So let's close that again and let's create a new Dolby Atmos master montage, and I'm going to put on my headphones for that, and let's click on create new Dolby Atmos master montage. Now it asks me to drop an ADM file here. I have one prepared. This is called The Man of My Dreams. And it's actually a relatively simple one. It has a total of 12 objects and a 7.1.2 bed. And in the bed, I only have ambience, so almost the entire audio is in the objects. Now, the first thing that it's going to ask me is to change or kind of select the import options. And the reason this is important is because in the Dolby Atmos master file, all the objects are mono objects. Now, every single object is dedicated to be a mono object. However, this is not the way you usually produce or mix a Dolby Atmos master track. Usually you're working with stereo tracks, and then you send the stereo tracks in the Dolby Atmos renderer, and they arrive as two objects really, an object for the left channel, an object for the right channel. And that connection between the left channel and the right channel is lost when you export a Dolby Atmos master file. And what Wavelab allows us to do is it allows us to recombine those. So for example, if I have objects 10, or objects 1 and object 2, so those are channels 10 and 11, be left and right channel of one stereo object that I used when I produced that particular Dolby Atmos master file, I can select those, and then I can click here on set selected objects to stereo tracks, and that will kind of combine them into one stereo track. Now, I don't need to do that individually. What I can actually do is I can select all of them here and then simply say set selected objects to stereo tracks, and what it will do, it will simply kind of assume that kind of two kind of make up one stereo object. Now it does the same thing also for the bed track. So even in the bed track, we have some stereo tracks and some mono tracks. We have a total of 4 stereo tracks that make the 7.1.2 bed. Those stereo tracks are the front channels, the side channels, the back channels, the top channels. And then we have two mono objects that are almost two mono tracks that are the center track and the LFE. And that is done automatically. Now, one disadvantage of that is that if you're working with a Dolby Atmos object bed, for example, so for example, you're not really happy with the 7.1.2 bed and want instead use a 9.1.6 bed, like many mastering engineers or many mixing engineers want to do, what you would normally do is you would create an object bed. So you would recreate a bed with the help of objects. Now, unfortunately, in WaveLab, you cannot recombine that again. So if you started out with a 9.1.6 in your production session, you cannot go into WaveLab and turn that into 9.1.6 again. You have to turn that into a combination of stereo and mono tracks, which is a little bit unfortunate because it means that you can't apply immersive audio plugins to object beds. You can apply immersive plugins, and we will see that a little bit later, only to the traditional 7.1.2 bed. However, we will be able to apply plugins in multi-mono or multi-stereo mode to even more immersive selections of channels. So if I have a 9.1.6, for example, so I have like 16 channels, what I will be able to do is I will be able to apply a plugin in multi-mono mode or multi-stereo mode to each of those channels simultaneously in such a way that if I make a change in one of those plugin instances, it propagates automatically to all the others. And we're going to see that in a second. So once again, you can apply plugins to object bed tracks. However, you cannot apply an immersive plugin to an object bed tracks. That's a very important distinction. Slightly unfortunate, but for most of you out there, that's probably not going to make a huge difference. Now, obviously, we can also change the track name. I'm going to just leave it here because there are not that many and I know which track is what. So I'm going to click OK here, and what that is going to do is going to ask me where to save it. It's going to be saved here on my desktop. I click OK, and that loads everything in. And I now have here in the montage view all the individual tracks. So once again, we have 6 tracks that make up the bed, tracks 1 through track 6. 4 stereo tracks, 2 mono tracks, and we have the 6 object tracks, which make up the 12 objects from the original Dolby Atmos master file. Now, before I listen to anything, let me first also check if the output settings are correct or the audio connections are set up correctly. And for that, I go here into the file section, and here under Preferences, audio connections, I need to make sure that the output configuration is set correctly. Now, in my case, what I did is I used the binaural layout, and the reason for that is simply because I'm creating this YouTube video and you guys want to hear what I'm doing here. But if you're working in an Atmos studio, obviously you would set that to whatever channel configuration you have. You're going to set that here. But once again, in my particular case, I'm simply going to use the binaural setup. Okay, so let's go back to our Atmos tab here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the Dolby Atmos renderer, and in order to get to the Dolby Atmos renderer, you need to click here on the inspector, and here we have the Dolby Atmos renderer as more or less the last plugin in the output section. And if we click on that, the renderer is going to open up. And we're going to see each individual object as a little kind of sphere here in this space. I can obviously kind of move that around. Now, unfortunately, I'm not able to do any head tracking in here. And if you're watching my channel for a while, you know that I'm a head tracking fanatic. I do a lot of videos about head tracking. You can't do that natively within WaveLab. If you're working with WaveLab and you want to use head tracking, then you would use an external application. So, for example, you could use Ginger Audio's Ground Control Sphere Immersive and do the head tracking in there, and then simply kind of send the audio from WaveLab into Ginger Audio Sphere. And if you are working on Windows, there are different options as well. Now, for this particular video, I'm not going to talk about it. I might do another video about that in the future, but for this video, we are just fine the way it is. So we are going to just have a binaural impression. And for that, and with that, let me just play the audio. And as you can see, the guitar is moving here a little, and we're going to use that a little later because in WaveLab you can actually influence, or you can actually change the events that are happening in the Dolby Atmos master file. So you could technically kind of change the positioning of those objects in your master session.
Here it comes, the master. Too good to be true. Long time I missed you.
So let's leave that for the moment being. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to close that window because I don't think I need that anymore. Now, obviously, what you have now is you have each individual track here in front of you, and you can operate with WaveLab on each individual track individually. So if you want to, for example, make certain changes to the audio of one of those stereo objects, you can open that like any other stereo file in WaveLab and can do all your mastering in there. So this is really, really nice. This is very unique that only WaveLab can do. But we can also kind of work in the settings, in the Atmos settings here directly. And for that, we have here in the inspector 4 different levels that we can operate in. And the first level is the clip level. Then we have the track level, then we have the bed level, and we have the output level. And depending on what track you're working with, there are different kind of types of possibilities that you have, what you can actually use. So if you, for example, have selected a track in the bed, you have these additional bed settings. If you are selecting a track in the object settings, then this disappears, obviously, because the object is not part of the bed, so it's not going to be affected by the bed. Now, a clip, obviously, is here a clip on the individual track. Now, in the way this is loaded in, obviously every clip is just one, or every track just has one clip. But we can actually kind of split it up. So if I want to, for example, here in the track number 11 is the vocals. So for example, let's say I want to separate out that particular portion of the vocals. I can simply select that, and then if I right click here, I can say create clip from selection, and what that will do is it will separate that as a clip. And now I have 3 clips here on that particular track, and that means that any changes that I make on the clip level are going to apply only to the clip, and any changes that I make on the track level are going to apply to the entire track. Now, if I want to fade that in, I can actually do that. So for example, I have certain changes made on the second clip and I want that to fade in. I can simply make a crossfade, and that works just fine. And depending on what kind of level you're in, there are different options that you have. So in all of those levels, we can apply outside VST3 plugins, and that's actually really nice. On the track level, we have additional effects. So for example, we can add additional cleaning effects, a dehammer, a denoiser, a de-esser. We can have an enhance effect, an exciter, a reverb, an EQ, a maximizer. And that allows you to work very efficiently within the Dolby Atmos environment of WaveLab directly, and you don't need to load in additional plugins. Now, how do I load in plugins? And this is actually relatively straightforward. So let's just go to the clip level here, for example. You see here the plus sign, and I click on that, and then I have all the different VST3 plugins that I have on my system, and I can load that in, and that is actually very convenient. There's a slight difference how this works for the output section. I'm going to come back to that in a second. One thing I need to point out is that in the bed section, if you load in a plugin in the bed section, let's load one in, for example, here, Litwick Sonics Cinematic Rooms, and that is an immersive plugin. What it will allow you to do is it will actually apply to the 7.1.2 bed as an immersive plugin. So if I'm clicking here on the settings, I actually see that Cinematic Rooms has identified that to be a 7.1.2 track. That essentially means that this plugin now operates on the entire bed and not just on an individual track or on an individual clip. That's actually really, really cool. Once again, unfortunately, this doesn't work for object bed tracks. So if you're working with object beds, you don't have the ability to use immersive audio plugins, but you can at least kind of use plugins in multi-mono mode. And once again, we're going to come back to that in a second. So let's go back to our audio and let's make a couple of changes. And I'm going to simply scroll down here because the changes I'm going to make are really here in the vocals. If I play the audio, you might have noticed that the vocal is a little hot. So there's a little kind of too much gain on the vocal. So what I can do is I can go here on track 11, which is the vocal track, and here on track, and let me just kind of close that here. So what I can do, for example, I can change the gain. This is maybe kind of something more like that. I can do the same thing for the bass, for example. If I want to increase the bass slightly, the bass is track number 7. Or I can increase that a bit if I want to. And as I said before, I can do all kinds of additions. I can add additional plugins that I want, clean up things, all kinds of things. And if that doesn't do what I wanted to do, then I can even load the clip, as I said before, into the traditional stereo setup of Wavelab and work there. So it's actually fairly powerful. Now, one thing that's really interesting is here in the output section, I have a different way of adding plugins to my mastering session. And the way these plugins work here in the output section is that they operate on each track simultaneously. And when I add a plugin here, so let's just add one. So let's maybe add the Tone Boosters Equalizer Pro. It will ask me that the plugin will instantiate it multiple times. So technically what's happening is I'm creating a plugin instance for each individual track in my mastering session. And the way this works is that when I change or make changes in one instance, it will propagate to all the other instances. I say yes, and that will essentially open up the plugin. Now I can then select what tracks are going to add to the sidechain of the plugins and what tracks are going to be affected by the plugin. And that means that if I have a certain subset of tracks that I want a plugin to operate on, but I want to operate it or kind of use it in a way that the settings are the same for all those tracks, I can use this immersive plugin hub to create a plugin that is propagated across all the instances, all the tracks. And then I can simply make a change in one instance and that change will propagate to the other instances. So let me just kind of maybe close that again because we don't really need that here. And let's just remove that plugin again. And then there's one thing that I think is really super interesting, and that is here in the Dolby Atmos events. So if I'm going to the Dolby Atmos events here, what I'm going to see is, first of all, a warning that I'm now going to embark on something that is really dangerous. Use with caution. Because what that allows me to do is it allows me to change the positioning of the individual sound object. So I'm saying, okay, and I already see here that in track 8, for example, I have a lot of individual events happening in the Dolby Atmos master file. And if you remember, when we played that file, the guitar was actually moving from the back to the front. And that is in the Dolby Atmos file as individual events. There are actually quite a lot of those. So this initial movement was just from here, from the very beginning to here down to 0.0.19. So actually quite a bit. Now, if we select each individual event, I can then go into that event and I can make changes to that event. So for example, I'm selecting the left position of that particular object, and then I can simply change that and kind of make certain changes. I'm going to undo. Now, obviously, because this is just a huge amount of events, if you want to change an entire path of an object, that would be impractical. But what you can do is you can simply say expand. That expands everything. And then I'm going to simply select everything. Or let me just kind of select them from here to, where are we? Okay, down to, yeah, maybe down to here. You get the picture. So I select all the individual events and then I can kind of change them simultaneously. Now, obviously, this is not particularly usable in the sense that you really need to know what you're doing. There's no visualization. I'm not really quite sure where everything is moving. So the way I think this is meant to be used is just as a last resort. So if you have a Dolby Atmos master file and something in there is terribly wrong. So for example, there's one event that kind of completely went awry and then suddenly there's a jump somewhere and you want to get that out. That's something that you can do here. I would probably not do that in kind of changing entire paths of objects. If I would need to do that, I would probably go back to the original mixing session and kind of make the changes there. But you could if you want to. So if you want to change entire paths, you can actually do that here within Wavelab, which I think is really, really, really cool. So a couple of final comments. First of all, we can change the trim down mix settings here. This is set to automatically by default, but if I uncheck that, I can make changes if I want to. Then I also have the possibility to change the ADM information. This is what was popping up at the very beginning, and if I somewhere in the middle realize that this is actually not the way I want it, I can go back and change that. So this is super cool. And then we have the loudness measurement. So if I click on that, it will actually measure the loudness. So let's kind of do that. It should be okay. I think it's slightly below minus 18 lufs, but I could be wrong. I made some changes in the file. Let's see. Oops, yeah, minus 19.3, so that would be actually fine. And then once I have made all my changes, and once again, I'm not going to go through all the nice features that you have in WaveLab with all the metering and everything. That's something I'm not going to do. I'm just going to focus on the Dolby Atmos thing. You can come here to the render section, and in the render section, you can render that out. Now, there are a couple of different ways on how you can render that out. You can either create a re-render. So if I click here on the named re-render, it will do that. And if I now click on start rendering, it will give me the option which ones I want to re-render. So do I want to stereo direct? Do I want the binaural re-render? Do I want to have the 9.1.6 re-render? I can do all of that. And I can also obviously export that again as an ADM, as a master file. And for that, I would simply click here on start rendering and it would render that out. And that's everything that you need to do in order to export everything back to Dolby Atmos. So all in all, this is really cool. This is incredibly powerful. This has a little bit of a learning curve, to be perfectly honest. If you're already working with WaveLab, then this is a godsend because it allows you everything that you already know about working with WaveLab to Dolby Atmos master files, which is super cool. There are a couple of slight quirks. I had a crash here and there, unfortunately, on my Mac. So just be aware, save regularly. And then obviously the slight problem that I would actually like to see 9.1.6 immersive audio plugins being usable, which is not the case right now. You can only use multi-mono or multi-stereo setups with plugins, which once again for most of you is fine, but it still would be nice if it would be possible to do a little bit more than just stereo and mono and kind of expand that to anything else. But other than that, really, really cool. So what's my final verdict? Well, it has been a while since we have seen one of the major developers add Dolby Atmos support to one of their products. So the addition of Atmos mastering capabilities to WaveLab is very well received. In my opinion, WaveLab is the most feature-complete mastering solution on the market today. The fact that it is built on top of what is already one of the most advanced mastering solutions for traditional stereo certainly adds to the appeal. So if you're serious about Atmos production, this might be a product you want to get. At the same time, the feature richness also makes it quite complex. There's undoubtedly quite a bit of a learning curve. Some of the competitive products, particularly Mastering Console by Fiedler Audio, might be easier to learn and use. If you're a hobbyist, someone just starting out, or if you need an Atmos mastering solution only once in a while, this is something worth considering. At the same time, all these solutions are in approximately the same price bracket, so you definitely get a better return on investment with WaveLab. The one thing that I think is still missing in WaveLab is the ability to use multi-channel plugins on object bed tracks. This is something that Fiedler Audio's Mastering Console has implemented through plugins in their OBAM standard, but at the same time, there are currently only a few OBAM plugins available, so this is only an advantage if you are already invested into the Fiedler Audio ecosystem. And if MP4 quality control deliverable export is important to you, you might also want to consider the Immersive Master Pro. Neither WaveLab nor the Fiedler Audio Mastering Console have that option. I have not yet done a video on Immersive Master Pro. If that's something you're interested in, let me know in the comments. I might also follow up with a more detailed comparison video between WaveLab, Fiedler Audio's Mastering Console and Immersive Master Pro. Well, that's everything for today. If you have any questions or comments, drop them in the comment section below or join our free Discord server. The invite link is in the description. And don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on all things Dolby Atmos and Immersive Audio. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.